Part 1. The Cruel Gift. Expanded story. Princess Zara stood at the tall window of her chamber, watching the twin moons rise over the crystal city of Cytheria. The purple light cast shadows across her face as she touched her stomach gently. Empty. Always empty. That single word had defined her entire life. In the Cytherian Empire, a princess who couldn't have children was like a flower that couldn't bloom. Beautiful to look at, but ultimately useless. Zara had learned this harsh truth early in life when the royal doctors delivered their verdict. She was 17 then, and the news had shattered not just her dreams, but her family's plans for her. Future, you know what they're saying about you in the courts? Her younger sister Lyra had asked that morning, her voice dripping with false concern. Lyra was everything Zara wasn't. Fertile, popular, and destined to inherit the throne. She had already given birth to 2 healthy children, securing her position as the Empire's golden child. Zara didn't answer. She had heard the whispers, the cruel jokes, the suggestions that she should be sent away somewhere far from the capital. The nobles called her the empty princess behind her back, and some even dared to suggest she was cursed by the ancient gods. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was the way her own father, Emperor Vex, looked at her now. Once she had been his favorite daughter, the one he'd take on walks through the royal gardens while sharing stories of their ancestors. Now his eyes held disappointment whenever they met hers. She'd become a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed. The council is meeting again today, Lyra continued, settling into a chair like a cat preparing to deliver bad news. They're discussing your future. Father thinks it's time you contributed to the Empire in other ways. Zara's heart sank. She knew what that meant. For months, whispers had circulated about the strange new species that had appeared in their solar system. Humans, they called themselves. Primitive creatures from a small blue planet who had somehow developed space travel. The Cytherian High Council had been debating whether to make contact or simply ignore them. They want to use me as a diplomatic gift, Zara said quietly, not really asking. Lyra's smile confirmed her worst fears. Think of it as an adventure. You'll be the first Cytherian to live among the humans. Father says it's a great honor. Zara knew better. This wasn't an honor. It was exile wrapped in pretty words. They were going to give her away to these unknown creatures, and everyone would pretend it was some grand gesture of intergalactic friendship. The truth was simpler and crueler. They wanted her gone. That evening, the formal announcement came. During the royal dinner, Emperor Vex stood at the head of the great crystal table, his voice carrying across the dining hall filled with nobles and courtiers. My daughter, Princess Zara, will serve as our ambassador to the human species. She will join their chief scientist in matrimony, symbolizing the bond between our peoples. The room erupted in barely contained laughter. Yes, Zara heard Lord Cain whisper. To his wife, finally a use for the broken princess. Lady Mora giggled behind her fan, saying the poor humans don't know what they're getting. But the cruelest reaction came from the royal physician, Dr. Altair, who had been the one to deliver Zara's diagnosis years ago. Perhaps the humans have different standards, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. What we consider defective, they might find adequate. Zara's hands trembled as she gripped her goblet. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to remind them all that she was still a princess of the Empire. Instead, she stood gracefully, bowed to her father, and said simply, I am honored to serve the Empire in this way. The preparations for her departure took 3 weeks. During this time, Zara learned everything she could about humans and their strange customs. They were shorter than Cytherians, lived much shorter lives, and seemed to value odd things like individual choice and emotional connections in their partnerships. Most surprisingly, they didn't seem to judge their leaders solely on their ability to produce offspring. Her personal servant, Kira, helped her pack belongings for the journey. Are you frightened, princess? Kira asked as she folded Zara's ceremonial robes. Terrified, Zara admitted. It was the first time she had spoken honestly about her feelings in months. I don't know anything about these humans. What if they're cruel? What if they treat me like a curiosity or an experiment? Kira paused in her work. Permission to speak freely, princess? Zara nodded. The humans can't possibly treat you worse than your own family has, Kira said softly. At least with them, you'll be starting fresh. They don't know about your condition. They don't know about the whispers and the jokes. To them, you'll just be Princess Zara, not the empty princess. Those words stayed with Zara as she said her final goodbyes. Her father's farewell was formal and distant. Serve the Empire well, he said, not even meeting her eyes. Her mother, Empress Nira, offered a cold embrace that lasted barely a second. Try not to embarrass us, she whispered. Only Lyra's goodbye felt genuine in its cruelty. Oh, well. Don't worry, sister, she said with a perfect smile. I'll make sure the Empire doesn't forget you. I'll tell my children stories about their brave aunt who sacrificed herself for diplomacy. As Zara's transport ship lifted off from the crystal landing pad, she pressed her face to the small window and watched her homeworld grow smaller. The beautiful spires of the capital city, the purple oceans, the silver forests, all of it fading into memory. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever loved. Even if that love had been one-sided, the journey to the human research station would take 2 days. Zara spent the time reading reports about her intended husband, Dr. Chen Li, a widowed scientist who studied alien biology. The humans had described him as kind but reserved, still grieving his late wife, who had died in some kind of accident. He had agreed to the marriage arrangement, though the reports didn't explain why. As her ship approached the small human station, orbiting a distant planet, Zara caught her first glimpse of her new home. It was nothing like the grand crystal palaces of Cytheria. The station was made of metal and glass, functional rather than beautiful. But somehow it didn't seem as cold as the palace she had left behind. The docking bay was small and simple. Through the window, Zara could see a group of humans waiting for her arrival. They were indeed shorter than Cytherians, and their skin came in different shades rather than the uniform pale blue of her people. One of them, a man with kind eyes and graying hair, stepped forward as her ship settled into the docking clamps. Dr. Chen Li, she realized. Her husband -2-B. For the first time in weeks, Zara felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly, but it wasn't the crushing weight of shame either. It was possibility. These humans didn't know she was broken. They didn't know she was the princess nobody wanted. To them, she was just a person from another world, starting a new chapter of her life. As the ship's door opened and she stepped onto the metal decking of the station, Zara made herself a promise. She would not let the cruelty of her past define her future. She would find a way to build something meaningful from the ruins of her old life. The humans welcomed her with genuine warmth. And for the first time in years, Zara felt like she might actually belong somewhere. She was no longer the empty princess of Cytheria. She was just Zara, and that was enough to begin again. Part 2. Unexpected Sanctuary. Expanded Story. Dar. Chen Li was nothing like what Zara had imagined. Standing in the small, welcoming chamber of the research station, she had expected to meet someone cold and calculating, perhaps even cruel. Instead, she found herself looking at a man whose eyes held the same kind of deep sadness she recognized in her own reflection. Princess Zara, he said, offering a slight bow that seemed more respectful than required. Welcome to Station Alpha. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant. Zara realized he was probably as nervous about this arrangement as she was. Don. Thank you, Dr. Chen. Please just call me Zara. Then you must call me Li, he replied with a small smile. Would you like to see your quarters first? Or would you prefer to meet the rest of the team? The question surprised her. On Cytheria, no one had ever asked her preference about anything. Decisions were made for her, schedules created without her input. My quarters, please, she said, curious about what the humans had prepared for her. Li led her through corridors that were clean but simple, nothing like the elaborate hallways of the royal palace. The walls were lined with windows showing the stars beyond, and Zara found herself stopping to look out at the vast emptiness of space. It was beautiful in a way that the carefully designed gardens of home had never been. The view takes some getting used to, Li said, noticing her pause. but I find it peaceful. All that space, all those possibilities. When they reached her quarters, Zara was amazed by what she found. The room was larger than she had expected, with a comfortable bed, a work desk, and even a small sitting area with chairs arranged around a low table. Fresh flowers, actual living flowers, sat in a vase by the window. "I wasn't sure what you would prefer," Lee said, seeming suddenly uncertain. "If you need anything changed, just let me know. These are your rooms, and you should feel comfortable." Here, Zara touched one of the flower petals gently. "They're beautiful. We don't have flowers like this on Cytheria." "They're roses," Lee said softly. My late wife loved them. I grow them in the station's greenhouse. I thought you might enjoy having something alive and growing in your space." There was such pain in his voice when he mentioned his wife that Zara felt her heart ache for him. She had been so focused on her own suffering that she hadn't considered that this human might be dealing with his own grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. Lee nodded, looking out the window. At the stars, "It's been 3 years now. The emptiness gets easier to live with, but it never really goes away." Emptiness. The word hit Zara like a physical blow, but not in the way it usually did. This time, she realized she wasn't alone in feeling empty. This kind human understood that particular type of pain. Over the following days, Lee showed her around the station. The research facility was small, but efficient, with laboratories, a library, living quarters for the 12-person crew, and even a recreational area where people could relax and socialize. Everyone treated her with respect and curiosity rather than the mocking politeness she was used to. "What exactly do you study here?" Zara asked Lee one afternoon as they walked through the main laboratory. "Life," he said simply. "How different species adapt to different environments. How they survive, how they thrive, how they connect with each other. The universe is full of incredible diversity, and I want to understand it all." Zara found herself spending more and more time in the lab, fascinated by Lee's work. He was studying samples from dozens of different worlds, trying to understand the basic principles that governed all life. His enthusiasm was infectious. Soon she was asking questions and offering observations based on her knowledge of Cytherian biology. "Have a natural talent for this," Lee told her, after she had made a particularly insightful comment about cellular structures. "Have you ever considered becoming a scientist?" The question caught her off guard. "On Cytheria, royal women don't become scientists. We're expected to produce the next generation of royalty." Lee looked at her carefully. "But you're not on Cytheria anymore. Here you can become whatever you want to be." That night, Zara lay in her bed staring out at the stars and thinking about Lee's words. Whatever she wanted to be. It was a concept so foreign to her that she could barely wrap her mind around it. All her life she had been defined by what she couldn't do, what she couldn't be. The idea that she might actually have choices felt revolutionary. Their meals together became a daily ritual. Lee was an excellent cook, and he seemed to enjoy introducing her to human foods. "This is pasta," he would say, or "this is called chocolate." Each new taste was an adventure, and Zara found herself laughing more than she had in years. "Tell me about your family," Lee asked one evening, as they shared dinner in his quarters. Zara's smile faded. "What would you like to know? Whatever you're comfortable sharing." "I know this arrangement wasn't exactly your choice." The gentle way. He said it made her want to tell him everything. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to speak about her condition. About the shame and rejection she had faced. About the cruel laughter that had followed her to the transport ship. Lee listened without interrupting, without judging. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "They were wrong," he said finally. "About what?" "About you being broken. About you being useless. You're one of the most intelligent, compassionate people I've ever met. Their inability to see your value says nothing about you and everything about them." Tears started flowing down Zara's cheeks. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. "But I can't give you children. I can't give you an heir. Isn't that what marriages are for?" Lee reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "Zara, I didn't agree to this arrangement because I wanted children. I agreed because I was lonely, and because I thought maybe we could help each other heal. You don't owe me anything except honesty and kindness, both of which you've already given me." As the weeks passed, their friendship deepened. Lee taught her about human culture, about the importance they placed on individual choice and emotional connection. Zara taught him about Catherian history and customs, and about the complex political situation that had led to her exile. "Do you miss it?" Lee asked one day, as they worked together in the greenhouse, tending to his collection of earth plants. "Sometimes," Zara admitted, carefully watering a small rose bush. "I miss the beauty of the crystal cities, the way the light danced through the spires. But I don't miss the pressure, the constant feeling that I was disappointing everyone just by existing." Lee nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. After my wife died, people kept expecting me to move on, to go back to being the person I was before. But grief changes you. A loss changes you. You can't go back to who you were." "But you can become someone new," Zara said, surprised by her own words. "Exactly." Lee smiled at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, Zara felt something she had never experienced before, the possibility of genuine happiness. Their relationship was built on understanding, on shared loneliness, and the gradual discovery that they didn't have to be lonely anymore. Lee never pressured her, never demanded more than she was ready to give. Instead, he offered her something precious: acceptance. One evening, as they sat together in the observation deck watching the stars, Lee turned to her and said, "Zara, I want you to know that whatever happens between us, you have a home here for as long as you want it. Not because of any diplomatic arrangement, but because you belong here." Looking at his kind face, illuminated by starlight, Zara felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't the desperate need for validation she had known all her life. It was something warmer, something that felt like hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the first time in my life, I actually feel like I might belong somewhere." And in that moment, surrounded by the infinite stars and sitting beside this gentle human who had shown her kindness when her own family had shown her cruelty, Zara began to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story was just beginning. Part 3. The Miracle of Science and Love expanded story 6 months after her arrival at the station. Zara stood in the small chapel that Lee had built in one of the unused storage rooms. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple space with flowers and candles, but it felt more sacred than any grand cathedral she had ever seen on Catheria. The wedding ceremony was small and intimate. Only the 12 crew members attended, but their genuine smiles and warm wishes meant more to Zara than the elaborate royal celebrations she had grown up with. When Lee looked into her eyes and promised to love and cherish her, she knew he meant every word. "You look beautiful," he whispered, as they exchanged simple silver rings that the station's engineer had crafted specially for them. "I feel beautiful," Zara replied, and for the first time in her life, she actually meant it. Their marriage was built on friendship and mutual respect rather than duty or political advantage. Lee never pressured her for anything she wasn't ready to give, and slowly, naturally, their relationship deepened into something neither of them had expected to find again. But as the months passed, Zara began to feel a familiar ache in her heart. Watching Lee interact with the younger crew members, seeing how naturally he mentored and cared for them, she found herself imagining what kind of father he would be. The thought brought both joy and deep sadness. "What's troubling you?" Lee asked. One evening, as they sat together in their shared quarters, he had become expert at reading her moods, and she could never hide her feelings from him for long. "I've been thinking about children," Zara admitted quietly. "See how good you are with people, how much you care about nurturing and teaching. You would make an amazing father." Lee set down his research tablet and turned to face her completely. "And you would make an amazing mother. I've watched you with the younger crew members too. You're patient, kind, and incredibly wise." "But it's impossible," Zara said, the old pain creeping back into her voice. "You know what the doctors on Catheria told me? I'm broken."
Oh.
Lee said firmly. "You're not broken. You're just different. And different doesn't mean hopeless." He stood up and walked to his computer terminal, pulling up files that Zara had never seen before. "I've been doing some research since you told me about your condition. The Catherian medical reports you shared with me were fascinating from a scientific perspective. Zara joined him at the terminal, curious despite her skepticism. What kind of research? Your condition isn't actually about being unable to conceive, Lee explained, his voice taking on the excited tone he used when discussing his work. It's about genetic incompatibility with traditional Cytherian reproduction. Your DNA has markers that prevent successful fertilization with typical Cytherian males. That's just a fancy way of saying I'm sterile, Zara said sadly. No, it's not. Lee pulled up a complex diagram showing genetic sequences. Look at this. It's human reproductive biology. Works completely differently than Cytherian biology. We don't have the same genetic restrictions, the same compatibility requirements. What makes you incompatible with Cytherian males might not apply to humans at all. Zara stared at the screen, afraid to hope. I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, the thing that makes you broken on Cytheria might not be a problem here. But we'd need to do extensive testing to be sure. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of medical examinations, genetic testing, and careful analysis. Lee worked with Dr. Patel, the station's medical officer, to understand Zara's unique physiology. They discovered that her reproductive system was actually completely healthy. It was just designed to work with a different type of genetic material than what was available on Cytheria. This is incredible, Dr. Patel said as she reviewed the latest test results. Your body has been waiting for the right genetic match your entire life. It's like having a key that everyone told you was broken, when really you just needed the right lock. Lee held Zara's hand as they listened to the doctor's explanation. There's still no guarantee, he said gently. This is all theoretical. Won't know for certain until we try. And if it doesn't work? Zara asked. Then we'll still have each other, Lee replied. You're enough for me, Zara. You've always been enough. But Zara wanted to try. For the first time in her life, she had real hope that she might be able to carry a child. Lee worked with her to develop a careful treatment plan that would give them the best possible chance of success. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day brought new tests, new monitoring, new hope, mixed with fear. Zara found herself terrified to believe that this might actually work, while simultaneously unable to think about anything else. I dreamed about holding a baby last night, she told Lee one morning as they walked through the station's greenhouse. I've never allowed myself to dream about that before. What did it feel like? Lee asked, gently touching a rose bloom. Like coming home, Zara said softly. Like finding a part of myself I never knew was missing. The day they got the positive test results, Zara stared at the medical scanner in complete disbelief. Are you sure? She whispered to Dr. Patel. Completely. Sure, the doctor replied with a huge smile. Congratulations, Zara. You're going to be a mother. Zara turned to Lee, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she threw her arms around him and held on tight. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. Lee was crying too, holding her close and spinning her around the small medical bay. I love you, he said over and over. I love you so much. Oh. Pregnancy progressed beautifully. Zara's body, which had been called broken and useless, proved to be perfectly designed for carrying their hybrid child. The baby was healthy and strong, growing exactly as it should. Have you thought about names? Lee asked one evening as they felt the baby kick against Zara's growing belly. I want to honor both our worlds, Zara said. Something that represents the bridge between human and Cytherian, between your culture and mine. They chose David Kale. David for Lee's grandfather, who had been a scientist and teacher. Kale, a Cytherian word meaning bridge or connection between worlds. As her due date approached, Zara found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She was no longer the empty princess that Cytheria had cast aside. She was a wife, a scientist, and soon to be a mother. She had found not just love, but purpose. Do you think they'll be surprised? She asked Lee, as they prepared the nursery they had set up in their quarters. Who? My family. My people. When they hear that the broken princess had a baby after all, Lee smiled and kissed her forehead. I think they'll be amazed. But more importantly, I think they'll finally understand what I've known all along, that you were never broken. You were just waiting for the right moment to bloom. David Kale was born, healthy and perfect. Zara held him in her arms and felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. This tiny being was proof that love could overcome any obstacle, that science and hope could work miracles. and that sometimes the things that make us different are actually the things that make us extraordinary. Looking at her son's face, which perfectly blended human and Cytherian features, Zara knew that her story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. She had gone from being the princess nobody wanted to the mother of a child who had bridged two worlds. And that was a miracle worth celebrating. Part 4. The Impossible Return. Expanded story. 3 years had passed since David Cale's birth, and life on the research station had settled into a beautiful rhythm. Zara woke each morning to her son's laughter echoing through their quarters, a sound that still amazed her after all this time. The child who was supposed to be impossible was now a toddler with his father's curious eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. "Mama, look," David Cale called out, holding up a small flower he had picked from Lee's greenhouse. At 3 years old, he was already showing signs of the enhanced intelligence that came from his mixed heritage, speaking in complete sentences and asking questions that sometimes surprised even Lee. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Zara said, kneeling down to admire his discovery. "Just like you." She had become more than just a mother during these peaceful years. Working alongside Lee, she had developed into a respected scientist in her own right. Her unique understanding of Cytherian biology, combined with her natural curiosity, had led to several breakthrough discoveries about cross-species genetics. The scientific community was beginning to take notice of their work, but their quiet happiness was about to be shattered. Zara Lee called from the communications center, his voice tight with worry. "You need to see this." She found him staring at a message on the main screen, his face pale with concern. The official seal of the Cytherian Empire glowed at the top of the transmission, and Zara's blood ran cold when she saw who had sent it. "Greetings, dear sister," came the recorded voice of Empress Lyra. Even through the static of long-distance space communication, her sister's voice carried the same mixture of false sweetness and underlying threat that Zara remembered so well. "Hope this message finds you well in your unique circumstances. It has been brought to my attention that you have achieved something quite remarkable during your time among the humans. The entire empire is buzzing with rumors about your impossible child." Zara's hands clenched into fists. Of course, the news had reached Cytheria. Nothing stayed secret for long in the interconnected galaxy, and the birth of the first human Cytherian hybrid was exactly the kind of story that traveled fast. "As Empress of Cytheria, I formally invite you to return home for my coronation celebration next month. It would be such an honor to have you present your achievement to the royal court. After all, families should be together during important moments." The message ended with Lyra's perfect smile, but Zara could read the threat behind her sister's words. This wasn't an invitation, it was a command wrapped in diplomatic language. "She can't force you to go," Lee said quietly, taking her hand. "You're not her subject anymore. You're a citizen of this station, a member of our crew." But Zara knew her sister better than that. "She doesn't need to force me. Look at the message again." She called David Cale an achievement. "She's not interested in seeing me. She wants my son." Lee's face darkened with understanding. "The Empire's population problems." Zara nodded grimly. Before her exile, she had heard whispers about Cytheria's declining birth rates. Same genetic restrictions that had made her barren were affecting more and more of the population. Their obsession with pure bloodlines was slowly killing them as a species. "They think David Cale might be the answer to their problems," she said. "A child who carries Cytherian genetics but isn't bound by our reproductive limitations." "Then we don't go," Lee said firmly. "We ignore the invitation and continue our life here." Zara picked up their son, who had been playing quietly nearby, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. "It's not that simple. If I refuse, Lyra will find other ways to pressure us. She could cut off diplomatic relations with the human colonies, or worse." Lee was quiet for a long moment, thinking, "What if we do go back? But on our terms, not theirs." "What do you mean?" "You're not the same person who left Cytheria 3 years ago. You're a mother, a scientist, a woman who has proven that their entire understanding of genetics was wrong. If you go back, you don't go as a supplicant begging for acceptance. You go as someone who has something they need." The idea was terrifying and empowering at the same time. Zara had spent her entire childhood trying to earn her family's approval, accepting their judgment that she was broken and worthless. But Lee was right. She wasn't that person anymore. "I could present our research," she said slowly, the plan beginning to form in her mind. "Show them that their genetic problems have solutions they never considered." "Exactly. And you wouldn't be going alone. David Kale and I would be with you every step of the way." Dr. Patel, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "I'd like to volunteer to come too. As the doctor who monitored your pregnancy, my testimony about the medical implications could be valuable." Over the next week, more crew members volunteered to join what they were calling a scientific expedition to Cytheria. What had started as a feared summons was transforming into something else entirely, an opportunity to share their discoveries with the people who needed them most. "Are you sure about this?" Lee asked the night before their departure as they packed their belongings. "Once we set foot on Cytheria, everything changes. We can't just be a happy family anymore. We'll be symbols, representatives of something bigger than ourselves." Zara looked at David Kale, sleeping peacefully in his small bed. "He's going to grow up in a galaxy where humans and Cytherians work together, where the barriers between species don't matter. But for that to happen, someone has to be willing to build those bridges. And you think that someone is us." "I think that someone is him," Zara said, gently touching her son's hair. "But first, I need to go home and show them that the princess they threw away became exactly what they needed." The journey to Cytheria took 5 days. As their ship approached the crystal spires of the capital city, Zara felt a complex mixture of emotions. The beauty of her homeworld still took her breath away, but it no longer felt like home. Home was wherever Lee and David Kale were. "It's pretty," David Kale said, pressing his nose against the window as they descended toward the royal landing pad, "but I like our station better." "Why?" Zara asked, curious about her son's perspective. "Because everyone smiles there. Here, everyone looks angry." From the mouths of children, Zara thought. Even at 3 years old, David Kale could sense the tension and rigid formality that defined Cytherian society as their ship touched down. Zara could see the welcoming party assembled on the landing pad. Empress Lyra stood at the center, surrounded by nobles and courtiers. Even from a distance, Zara could see the calculating look in her sister's eyes as she stared at the human ship. "Ready?" Lee asked, taking her hand. Zara straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She was no longer the broken princess they had sent away in shame. She was Dr. Zara Chen, scientist, mother, and bridge between worlds. And she was about to show Cytheria exactly what they had lost when they decided she wasn't worth keeping. "Ready," she said, stepping toward the airlock. "Let's go change history." Part 5. The Mother's Triumph expanded story the moment Zara stepped off the ship onto the crystal landing pad of her homeworld. She felt the weight of 1,000 stares. The welcoming party stood in perfect formation, their faces carefully composed to hide their curiosity and shock. At the center of it all stood Empress Lyra. It's older now, but still radiating the cold beauty that had always made her the favorite daughter. "Sister," Lyra said, approaching with arms outstretched in a gesture that looked warm but felt calculated. "Welcome home." The embrace was brief and formal, but Zara felt her sister's sharp intake of breath when she saw David Kale in Lee's arms. The child was obviously half Cytherian, the distinctive silver blue eyes of their people. But his features held an exotic blend that marked him as something entirely new. "And this must be your son," Lyra said, her voice carefully neutral. But Zara caught the flash of hunger in her sister's eyes as she looked at David Kale. Not love or familial affection, but the calculating gaze of someone seeing a valuable resource. "His name is David Kale," Zara said firmly, moving closer to Lee's side. "And this is my husband, Dr. Lee Chen." Lee stepped forward with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Your Majesty," he said, with a respectful bow. "Thank you for your hospitality." The formal greetings continued as they were introduced to various nobles and courtiers. Zara recognized many faces from her childhood, though they looked at her now with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed calculation. She was no longer The broken princess, they remembered, she was the woman who had achieved the impossible. The coronation ceremony is tomorrow evening, right? Lyra said as they walked through the crystal corridors toward the guest quarters. But first, we must catch up properly. There's so much I want to learn about your ... experiences ... among the humans. Zara knew exactly what her sister really wanted to know. How had she managed to have a child? Could the process be replicated? Was David Cale truly healthy, or was he some kind of genetic anomaly that would die young? Their guest quarters were luxurious, but felt like a beautiful prison. Guards stood at attention outside their door, officially for protection, but really for surveillance. Zara noticed how their movements were carefully monitored, how conversations stopped when they entered rooms, how David Cale attracted stares wherever they went. "I don't like it here," David Cale whispered to his mother that first night as she tucked him into the ornate bed. "Everyone looks at me funny." "They're just curious, sweetheart," Zara said gently. "You're very special, and they've never seen anyone like you before." "Am I really special, or am I weird?" he asked with the blunt honesty of a 3-year-old. Zara's heart ached at the question. She had wondered the same thing about herself for so many years. "You're special," she said firmly. "And being different isn't the same as being weird. Sometimes being different is exactly what the world needs." The next day brought a series of formal meetings disguised as family visits. Lyra introduced Zara to the current High Council, the same group of nobles who had laughed when she was sent away. Now they looked at her with nervous respect, clearly aware that she held knowledge they desperately needed. "The Empire has been facing some ... challenges. In recent years," Lord Kane admitted during one particularly tense discussion. "Our population growth has slowed significantly." "You mean your obsession with genetic purity is finally catching up with you?" Zara said bluntly, causing several council members to shift uncomfortably. "Now, Sister," Lyra said with false sweetness, "surely we can discuss these matters more diplomatically." "Why?" Zara asked. "You didn't use diplomacy when you sent me away. You didn't use diplomacy when you laughed at my condition. But now that I have something you need, suddenly we're supposed to be polite." The room fell silent. A moment Zara felt like she was 17 again, standing before these same people as they pronounced her worthless. But this time, she wasn't alone. Lee stood beside her. David Cale played quietly nearby, and she carried with her the knowledge that she had built something beautiful from the ruins of their rejection. "I came here because you summoned me," Zara continued, her voice growing stronger. "But not because I owe you anything. I came because I have information that could save your empire. And despite everything you've done to me, I still care about my people." That evening was the coronation ceremony, the grandest celebration Kytheria had seen in decades. The great crystal hall was filled with nobles, diplomats, and dignitaries from across the galaxy. Zara wore a simple but elegant dress that Lee had chosen for her. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. When Lyra took the crystal crown and officially became empress, the hall erupted in applause. But Zara noticed how many eyes in the crowd kept drifting to her and her family, as if the real news of the evening wasn't the coronation but her impossible return. "And now," Lyra announced as the formal ceremony concluded, "I would like my beloved sister Princess Zara to address the court." It wasn't a request, it was a command delivered with a smile. Lyra wanted Zara to share her secrets publicly, to give the Empire access to the genetic breakthroughs that had made David Cale possible. Zara stood slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the massive hall. Lee squeezed her hand encouragingly, and David Cale looked up at her with complete trust. She walked to the center of the hall, where a speaking platform had been prepared. 3 years ago," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the crystal acoustics, "you sent me away because you believed I was broken. You laughed when I was given to the humans because you thought it was a joke. You called me worthless because I couldn't fulfill the only purpose you saw for women of royal blood." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Zara continued. "You were wrong about everything. I wasn't broken, I was just different. My genetics weren't flawed, they were waiting for the right match. And what you saw as my greatest weakness became the foundation of my greatest strength." She gestured toward Lee and David Cale. My husband and my son represent the future, not just of our species, but of what becomes possible when we stop fearing difference and start embracing it. The research we've conducted could solve your population crisis, but only if you're willing to change your fundamental beliefs about genetic purity. The hall was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I'm not here to beg for acceptance or forgiveness. I'm here to offer you a gift, the same gift you unknowingly gave me when you forced me to leave. The gift of discovering that sometimes our greatest failures lead to our most incredible successes. She paused, looking directly at Lyra. But this gift comes with conditions. If you want access to our research, you stop treating reproduction like a political tool. Stop defining people's worth by their ability to produce children. You start building a society where every person has value regardless of their differences. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers and heated discussions. Some nobles looked offended by her demands, while others seemed intrigued by the possibilities she offered. Lyra stood slowly, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "Sister, perhaps we should discuss these matters privately," Zara said firmly. "I've spent enough of my life hiding in private rooms while others made decisions about my fate. If you want to discuss my terms, we do it here in front of everyone." A long moment, the two sisters stared at each other across the crystal hall. Finally, Lyra nodded slowly. "Very well. Empire accepts your terms. We'll work together to implement your research while reforming our social policies." It was a political victory, but more importantly, it was a personal one. Zara had returned to the place that had rejected her, not as a supplicant, but as someone offering salvation to the very people who had cast her aside. As the celebration continued around them, Lee approached with David Cale in his arms. "So what happens now?" he asked. Zara looked around the crystal hall, then up at her family. "Now we go home, our real home among the stars. But we'll come back regularly to help implement the changes. Someone needs to build the bridges between our worlds. And that someone is us," Lee asked with a smile. "That someone is him," Zara said, gently touching David Cale's cheek. "We're just making sure he has a galaxy worth growing up in." As they prepared to leave Catharia the next day, Zara felt no sadness about departing. She had returned as they never expected, not as their discarded princess, but as the mother of their future. And that was the greatest victory of all.